Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Barry Johnson with us in a session called Polarity Management. Barry is the author of And Making a Difference, or Making a Difference by Leveraging Polarity, Paradox or Dilemma, plus the book Polarity Management, Identifying and Managing Unsolvable Problems. He's the chairman of Polarity Partnerships. I think it was in 1975 he created the original set of principles that is now known today as Polarity Management. And given my work on mimetic tribes and mimetic mediation, people have been researching or reaching out to me saying, you got to check out Barry's stuff. So I've been aware of Polarity Management for a while, but I haven't done a deep dive on it yet. So I'm quite excited for today's session. And how it is going to work, I'm going to take in Barry in a moment. He's going to share his screen and present a high level of what Polarity Management is. And then we're going to go to Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, just put them in the chat. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, ask your question to Barry. If you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question on your behalf. So that being said, Barry, welcome to the Stoa.
Well, thanks a lot for having me here, Peter, and I'm looking forward to this. So let me just share my screen, and so what I'd like to do is first of all just ground this in the mission of Polarity Partnerships. Our desire is to enhance our quality of life on the planet by supplementing or thinking with and thinking. And what I want to do is in the first part of this, I'm going to run through a little bit about what are polarities and then how you distinguish a problem from a polarity. And then we're going to engage you in filling out a couple of polarity maps and get involved in a case study example. And after that case study example, we'll open it up for questions. And so I won't be taking questions until we get through that process to have the grounding to respond to those questions. So in terms of a summary, polarities are interdependent pairs. They're also known as paradox, dilemma, or tensions. They're also energy systems in which we live and work. So we can leverage them just like we can leverage gravity or sunlight. They're energy systems at play. Why bother? There's a couple of primary reasons. One is to effectively address resistance to change. It can support you in having those change efforts happen faster and be more sustainable. Second, it helps you effectively address polarized conflict and convert vicious cycles into virtuous cycles. So use that inherent energy that exists within the polarization to make progress. So one of the underlying polarities in all organizations is about being effective leaders and effective organizations. Do we focus on leadership development or organizational development? The answer is yes. Like all polarities, we need to focus on both to really have effective organizations. And the research is really clear, by the way, whether you call it paradox, dilemma, or polarity, or just tensions. Leaders and organizations that leverage these interdependent pairs, when they do it well, they outperform those who don't. And here are a couple of examples of some leadership polarities: being clear and being flexible. So I'd like you to just think of a leader that you have some respect for. He or she or they are really, they're just very good at leaders from your perception. My guess is that one of the leadership polarities that they will be pretty good at that makes them a good leader is that they're able to be both clear and flexible. Because if they were clear without being flexible, they would end up being experienced as rigid. If they were flexible without being clear, they'd be seen as ambiguous. So somehow what they've managed to do is get the benefits of clarity and the benefits of flexibility. And if you'll notice how this infinity loop here goes high up above each of these. And with all polarities, what we're trying to do is maximize these upside benefits and minimize the downsides, minimize being rigid and minimize being ambiguous. So if you can combine that clarity and flexibility, it will lead to effective leadership. With all polarities, what we're trying to do is first see them, and then how do we maximize the benefit that each bring and minimize their limitations? So another example in leadership is task and relationship. we need to focus on getting the task done, and we need to build relationships. At the organizational level, one fundamental polarity is stability and change. How do we hold on to the best of our past and present and create new opportunities for our future? Another key polarity, this one showed up when I was working in Brazil. They had learned about polarity thinking through an associate of mine, and they invited me to come down there to work with their executive team. And when I arrived at the, had a ride from the airport to the front of their main building, the woman, warmly greeted me in the front of the building. And as she's walking me into their corporate headquarters, there's a big plaque on the wall going in, and it's written in Portuguese, of course. And she said, "Barry, let me share with you what this says. It says, being well and well-being." And she said, "This is what we do here, is we try to pay attention to how do we make sure that we're fiscally sound, which is being well, and well-being is taking care of our employees, the community, and the environment." So this question, how do we take care of our own fiscal soundness and take care of our employees, community, environment, is a fundamental underlying polarity. And when she shared that with me, she said, so Barry, it looks like we already know something about polarities. And I said, absolutely. It just warmed my heart to see that. And one of the messages that I want to share with you in reference to this is that all of you have been living with polarities your whole life. You may not have called them that, paradoxes or dilemmas, but they've been a part of your life. So you already have some experience and ability to work with them. And so effective leaders are already doing it. They might not call it that, but what we're bringing to this wisdom that you already have from your life experience is one way to see them and to create a model for looking at them, and then a way of intentionally leveraging them. So it can be more intentional and it can be collaborative. You and others can be doing it together. So I'd like to make a distinction between a problem and a polarity. A problem requires or thinking, while a polarity, since it's an interdependent pair, it requires and thinking. We need to include both over time. So for example, if I were given an invitation to leave my job and join another company, I've got a decision to make. It's an or decision. Am I going to stay or am I going to leave? If I decide to stay, then leave is off the table, and I've essentially solved the problem. A really simple problem: choose this or this. Whole countries choose between one candidate or another for running the country. And so we have either or choices all the time when we're trying to solve problems. And often when we get into a conflict, we think, well, what is the best solution or the right solution among many? And we're making this either or choice. So or thinking is absolutely essential in basic problem solving, for sure. But if we experience tension and a difficulty, and we bring or thinking to that difficulty, it doesn't make any sense. So for example, one of the fundamental, very simple metaphors for all polarities is inhale and exhale. Now, since we know the cycle time is so short with breathing, we know clearly that we need to inhale and exhale. It doesn't make sense to fight over whether we're going to inhale or exhale for the future, and thinking is required because over time we're going to have to do both. And so it's a false choice. We need to do both. So one of the reasons we bring and to all polarities, we connect the two poles with and because over time we're going to need both. That's what it means to have them be interdependent. Now there's another dimension here, and that is that there's an energy system at play that oscillates between and around these two poles. And so when we inhale, if everybody would just join me with this for a second, I'd like you to just inhale deeply. Inhale. Notice as you inhale, you get oxygen, which is a great benefit. But over time, if you keep holding your inhalation, you'll experience excess carbon dioxide, which will cause you to go ahead and exhale if you haven't. When you exhale, you clear out the carbon dioxide, and it's a necessary thing to do, but it's not a solution. If you've held that exhalation long enough, you're going to experience a lack of oxygen, and go ahead and inhale again to make this work. So let's just notice what's happening here. When this energy system crosses between the two poles in this metaphor, it keeps them apart. Inhaling and exhaling never throughout our life become the same thing. So with polarities, you're not talking about merging them into one same thing. They are differentiated. The energy system differentiates them, but notice it also wraps around them. So you can never separate inhaling from exhaling. Over time, you're going to be required to engage the other pole. So this is how all polarities work in a simple metaphor. So in summary, you have two poles connected by and. There's an energy system at play. And in that energy system, there are going to be two upsides. Each pole brings a benefit to the system. With inhaling, you get oxygen. With exhaling, you clear out carbon dioxide. So with all polarities, there are two upsides, but there's also two limits, the limits of each downside. And when you experience the limit of one downside, the natural antidote is the upside of the other pole. That's what causes it to continue to move. So that's how all polarities work. Now I want to just move into a polarity with a slightly longer cycle time, sort of a 24-hour cycle time of activity and rest. And what I'd like to do with this one is I'd like to have you in the chat join me in just identifying the content. All of us are leveraging this polarity every day. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like you to identify what would be the positive results from physical and mental activity. So you wake up, you go to work, or you go to play, or whatever you do, but what would those, give you 5 seconds, and Peter, if you would just read what's showing up in the chat room, what are the positive results from physical and mental activity? Go ahead.
Fun,
Uh-huh.
joy, getting stuff done, fitness, de-stress.
Okay, great. Exactly. So activity has all sorts of upside benefits, some of which you've identified there. I've got them in terms of mind and body. Have a sharp mind, the body gets toned, and you're stimulated and challenged. And the stuff that you said works as well. Okay, so this is the reason we're active, is to get these benefits and the benefits that you mentioned. So activity has a great upside. However, activity without rest, without its partner rest, leads to a downside. What are the negative results from over-focusing on activity to the neglect of rest? 5 seconds more. What happens when you go after activity for all those good reasons, but you neglect rest? What do we got?
Exhaustion, twice, exhaustion again, damage, injury.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so what happens is the sharp mind becomes a mind on overload, a body tone becomes a body exhausted, and instead of being stimulated and challenged, it becomes being burned out. So everything that you said works, of course, because all of us, we're in this polarity on a moment by moment basis. Notice another thing that's happening here. You can't go someplace and decide, am I going to do activity and rest? I mean, you're in it for the long haul. You're just in the polarity of activity and rest. Organizations that are dealing with polarities, they are in those polarities as long as they're active as an organization. So, and another important point, notice that there's a great upside to activity, but also this great upside without its partner becomes a disaster. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with activity. It's activity without rest leads to this disaster. When we experience the downside of a pole, we experience its limits, we call it a problem. And it is a problem. It's problematic. And what happens is we think, oh, what do I need to do? My mind's on overload. My body's exhausted. I'm burned out. What I need to do is go to the self-correction of this downside, which is actually going after the benefits of rest. So what are the positive results from physical and mental rest? 5 more seconds. Go ahead.
Rejuvenation.
Uh-huh.
Clarity.
Yep.
Recreation.
Yeah. Great.
Renewal.
Okay. Yep. So what happens is our mind on overload gets allows us time to integrate those thoughts. Our body exhausted, we can rejuvenate our body, that some said. And instead of being burned out, we can be relaxed. So notice how the natural antidote to the downside of one pole is the upside of the other. Now, what happens is this gets identified as a problem, and this gets identified as a solution. And in one sense, it is, but it's not really an ultimate solution. It is a natural self-correction, which is necessary to get these benefits. However, over time, if we overfocus on rest to the neglect of activity, we get another downside. So we discover it's not an ultimate solution because it has its own limits. What would be the negative results from overfocusing on rest to the neglect of activity? Imagine yourself being sort of bedridden for a month with no, you can't read and you can't watch TV or whatever. So what would some negative results be if you had all rest with no activity?
Depression, boredom.
Yep.
Laziness.
Yeah, great. Okay. So absolutely. So instead of a sharp mind up here, you have a dulled mind. Instead of being body toned, you're out of shape. And instead of being stimulated and challenged, it's bored and lack of stimulation. So the real opposites in a polarity map, notice, are these diagonals and these diagonals. The diagonals are the real opposites. Activity and rest aren't really opposites. They're an interdependent pair that meet each other over time. What happens now is this could be identified as a problem. I've got this problem, and we end up going here for a solution. So with all polarities, there's two upsides that can be called solutions, but they're not actually ultimate solutions, because if you focus on one without the other, either becomes a problem. So again, this is how all polarities work. So now we've seen polarities and their dynamics. The next question is, so what are you talking about when you say leverage a polarity? What we're talking about, before I leave this slide, notice how or thinking makes no sense. Am I going to do activity or rest for the future? In the long term, that makes no sense because I have to do both. Polarities are always a false choice in terms of choosing one or the other. So let's, and is required. So now let's look at leveraging a polarity. If you wanted to run a marathon, now you have to be intentional about the polarity of activity and rest. Everybody in the world is dealing with the polarity of activity and rest. They have it available to them. All of us have it available, but not all of us can run a marathon. If you want to run a marathon, now here's a larger polarity map. We've got the two poles of activity and rest. And ideally, this infinity loop shows we want to maximize both upsides and minimize the downsides. So if you're in a position where you can't run a marathon, this would be true of most of the world's population, but your goal is you want to move towards what we call the greater purpose. If you want to run a marathon, now you have to be intentional about the activity and rest polarity that is available to you and everybody else. So if you're in a regimen for preparing, let's say you're going to prepare for 6 months to run a marathon. So what you want to do on the activity side, to get the benefits of activity, the benefit is you want to increase your endurance. In order to increase your endurance, what you need to do is you need to create an action step to support this upside. And so what you need to do is run further most workout days. That will increase your endurance. Now, the upside of rest in relation to preparing for a marathon is that your muscles actually build on the rest cycle, assuming that you've been active. So muscles build not while you're actually running, but while you're giving yourself a rest. So the muscles build on the rest cycle. What would be an action step you could use to make sure your muscles build? That would be get adequate downtime between workouts. So if you want to run a marathon, you need to run further each workout day and get adequate downtime to build up your muscles. And that will move you towards running a marathon. Now, there's two other elements to pay attention to when you're leveraging a polarity. And that is, you need to know early that you're getting into one downside or the other because you've overfocused on their upside. So for example, if you overfocus on activity to the neglect of rest, you will get a muscle injury. How would you know early that you're headed towards a muscle injury becomes the question. And the answer is, one possibility, one early warning would be that you feel tired when you wake up and you realize, well, I had to work late last night and I'm supposed to run 10 miles according to my regimen schedule. I'm supposed to run 10 miles today, but I'm really feeling tired. I only had 6 hours sleep and I normally get 8. So I'm going to go ahead and do my workout, but I'm going to cut back and I'm only going to run 6 miles today. So I get the workout in, but I'm going to avoid a sports injury. So that would be a way to avoid muscle injury. Now, what happens if you overfocus on rest to the neglect of activity is you get muscle atrophy. And if you're not getting up, getting out of bed, and if you're not working out, then your muscles are going to atrophy. How would you know early that you're headed towards muscle atrophy? Well, maybe you just miss a workout day entirely because you were so late. You know, you say, I just don't, I've got a busy day today. I just don't have time for that workout. Now, notice if you're in a 6-month process, it doesn't matter that you miss one workout day, but it's an early warning of something that you can't continue to do, or you will end up with muscle atrophy. So the way to leverage a polarity is to first see it as a polarity and know you need to see what the upsides are and what the downsides are. And then you need to create action steps to make sure you maximize both upsides and give yourself early warnings to know that you minimize the downsides. So a couple of other things about all polarities while we're summarizing how polarities work here. If you overfocus on one pole of a polarity to the neglect of the other, you always get the downside of one pole first, then you get the downside of the other pole as well. So for example, my son Tim has qualified 6 times for the Boston Marathon. But on one of those occasions, between qualifying in the Detroit Marathon for the Boston Marathon, he decided he wanted to reduce his marathon time, and he pushed himself too hard. He focused on running further and faster, running faster, not further, because he had the marathon done, but now he wanted to run it faster. So he was trying to increase his endurance. He overdid it. And what happened is he overfocused on the activity to the neglect of rest, and he ended up getting shin fractures. So now he had a muscle injury. Because he had a muscle injury, he ended up being laid up. Not only could he not run in the Boston Marathon, but he ended up being laid up in bed. So this is how all polarities work. First, you get the downside. If you overfocus on one pole to the neglect of the other, first you get the downside of one, then the other. The objective is to maximize both upsides by minimizing the downsides. That will help you run a marathon, and you do it by your action steps and early warnings. So that's the essence of how polarities look and work and how you leverage them. So now I want to introduce you to our small process for seeing and leveraging polarities. And then we're going to share a case study, and then we'll get into some questions and answers. So we call it the small process for leveraging polarities. And the SMALL stands for seeing. First, you need to see that it is a polarity. Oh, this is one of those interdependent pairs. Next, you need to map it. If it is a polarity, it will have 2 upsides and 2 downsides, and you can identify a greater purpose and a deeper fear as to respond to why manage it well. Once you have created content, then you can assess it. How well are we doing at getting both upsides and minimizing both downsides to lift it towards its greater purpose? Then you can do is you can learn from that assessment, and that supports you in the leveraging, which is to create action steps for each upside and early warnings for each downside. And every step of the way, you need to engage key stakeholders. They'll help you identify which polarities are most important, help you identify the upsides and downsides, help you assess how well you're doing, and help you think about action steps and early warnings. So that's our process. So I'd like to share with you now a situation that we ran into a number of years ago where I was on the phone. I'd like you to imagine you're with me now, and you're on the phone with it's a multinational organization. It's located in 46 countries. It's a Fortune 25 company in the United States, and you're on the phone with them, and in the conversation you're having with them, you're helping them design a half a day on polarity thinking, because they're bringing their top 200 people from around the world together for a leadership sort of acknowledgement. It's a celebration of they've had a really good year, and they want to celebrate that, and they want to incorporate in the celebration some leadership development opportunities. So you're going to spend a half a day with them on polarity thinking. So you're talking with the chief operating officer, the chief learning officer for the company, and the head of the design team that is preparing this leadership development week. And in the beginning of the conversation, one of the things they say is, Barry, we want you to know our theme for this gathering. And the theme is leading through values. And my response to them is, well, that's terrific, because values tend to come in pairs. And so if you're looking at leadership, we can look at values and values pairs, and it'll be a great combination of this theme and polarity thinking. And the chief operating officer says, wait a minute, are you saying that values come in pairs? And I said, yes, sir. So if I'm working with an organization and they're just starting to create their values, I encourage them to look at values pairs and lay them that way in the first place. If they have a list of values and they don't have them in pairs, I look with them at their values, and we see if in their list of values, if they have one value in the list and its interdependent pair is also in the list. If so, I encourage them to put them as a pair. And if they have a value that doesn't have a pair in the list, I encourage them to just add that value pair in order to make sure that they're not vulnerable to just focusing on one pole of a polarity. So the chief operating officer says, wait a minute. If you're going to be talking about our values in front of our top 200 people, I want to know what you would do with them. And he said, I'm going to send you our values right now. Here's our values. So he sent me the values. And he said, okay, Barry, this is our values. Now, what do you think? So one of the values that showed up was autonomous business units. Now, if you're located in 46 countries, you need to have some autonomy for your business units, clearly. Even if you're only located in one country, your business units need some degree of autonomy to be effective. So I wanted to give them a competitive advantage by looking at their values list through a polarity lens. So I had this greater purpose up here, and down here, the deeper fears can't compete. So what I'd like your help with now is, again, 5 seconds per quadrant in the chat room. I'd like you to help me fill out this polarity map. We're just going to do 5 seconds in each quadrant. So when he asked me what I made of his autonomous business units, I said, well, what I was looking for is some value that would be an interdependency to autonomous business units that would make sure that they were not vulnerable to an overfocus on autonomous business units, some balancing sister pole. What would I be looking for in the chat room? 5 seconds. What would, and I'm not looking for sort of just one correct word or phrase, but what kind of word would you be looking for? What kind of focus would be necessary to keep autonomous business units from becoming dysfunctional? What would balance it out? 5 seconds in the chat room. What comes to mind?
Okay. Collaboration, coordination, centralized, collectivist.
Yep, exactly. So, what I put is integrated, but everything works: coordinated, centralized, coordinated, integrated, etc. So they had nothing like that. They didn't have any of the words that you just mentioned, right? So I said to them, I notice you have autonomous business, but you don't have anything like integrated business units or coordinated or centralized. And of course, it wasn't there. It was easy to see. They only had, about 5 or 6 values on the list, and none of those showed up. So, and they looked and they said, right, it's not there. So what do you make of that? And I said, well, from what I know about polarities now and what you know from what I just said in the summary, there are going to be negative results from over-focusing on autonomous business units to the neglect of integrated business units because they don't have integrated or centralized there. So you tell me, I said this organization is experiencing or will experience the following dysfunction. What are those dysfunctions? 5 seconds, go. Over-focus on autonomous business units to the neglect of centralized, coordinated, integrated business units.
Misalignment, chaos, inefficiency.
Yep, exactly. So I ended up with a longer list, but exactly what you said. You're going to have silos, isolation of business units, excess competition, inefficiencies. Exactly. So I said to them, your organization is experiencing or will experience these silos, isolation of business units, excess competition, and the items that you mentioned. So I said at some point, you're going to identify this as a problem. When you do, you're going to bring your business unit heads together with your executive team, and you're going to decide how to solve that problem. Now, what they will be doing in their solution is they will be going after the benefit of integrated business units or centralized coordination. But they're just looking at it as a problem of the solution. I said, you're going to come up with some things you're going to agree that you want to do to solve the problem of the silos and excess competition. What are the things they say they're going to go towards, which will be the upside of integrated business units? What are those upsides that they're going to say they're going to move towards? 5 seconds, go.
Moving together, communication, unified mission, synergies.
Yep. Exactly. So what we've got here is from silos and isolated competition, integration of business units, collaboration, mutual support, synergies, communication, everything you said. They were going to meet and they're going to agree to do that. So as I continue on the phone with them, I said, you're going to agree, everybody's going to agree that that's where you want to go, and then you're not going to go there. Now, there's silence on the end of the phone, and I wait for a few moments in the silence, and I finally say hello, and a gruff voice comes back. It's the chief operating officer, and he says to me, "Who have you been talking to?" And I say, I haven't been talking with anybody. I just understand how values work and how polarities work. And so this is very predictable. And he said, wait a minute. I understand how from our autonomous business units, you'd come up with the silos and the excess competition, lack of coordination, et cetera. And I understand how you'd come up with the integration and the collaboration and centralized coordination, et cetera. How you'd come up with those things. But did I hear you correctly when you said, we're not going to walk our talk? And I said, yes, sir. And I said, well, I want to know how you knew that, because I had this conversation 2 years ago with all the business unit heads and the administration, and we agreed to the person, and unions supported it. Everybody agreed that that's where we're going to go, but we've hardly moved an inch in 2 years. I want to know, this is costing us millions. I want to know how you knew we weren't going to walk our talk when we all agreed to do it. And I said to them, well, that's why I'm coming to spend a half a day with you and the top 200. But essentially, this is what I was aware of, is that they are likely to see this as a problem with a solution, and they were likely to use gap analysis, in which they see this is the problem with the present state, and we need to bridge the gap by going to this future state solution. What would be missing from a polarity perspective is that there's an upside of autonomous business units that they value, and they're afraid they're going to lose it. So what would be the positive result from doing a good job of allowing autonomous business, your autonomy for your business units if you're located in 46 countries? This is a key part of their culture that caused them to have autonomous business units in the first place. What are the positive results for autonomy of your business units? Go.
Activity, agility, speed, freedom.
Yep, exactly. Bingo, you got it. Okay, so speed and responsiveness, agility, entrepreneurial initiative, et cetera, everything you said. Now, notice in the gap analysis process with a problem and a solution, and assuming all we have to do is just have some action steps to support this upside, what's missing from a gap analysis is the upside of the pole you're moving from and the downside of the pool you're moving towards. So if you love entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness at 99 on the 100 scale, you're going to be afraid of losing it when you go to this pole. The fear of the downside was what was going to keep them from going after their upside. So, because this is what they want to avoid. The stronger they want to hold on to this, the more they want to avoid this. So now we have one more quadrant to fill out. So the question is, what would be the negative results if you over-focused on integrated business units to the neglect of autonomous business units? You can just put not in front of this and put it down here. What is this culture, not just individuals, but the whole culture, afraid would happen if they went to integrated business units? 5 seconds, go.
One size does not fit all, too much groupthink, herd mentality, making everything slow and stiff, Titanic, analysis paralysis.
Exactly. Wonderful. Now, so you'd be afraid of instead of entrepreneurial initiative, you'd have bureaucracy and red tape. Instead of speed and responsiveness, you'd be slow and unresponsive, and everything that you generated. I'd like to point out something here now. You generated in a total of 20 seconds the content for a polarity map, the ineffectiveness of which, the misdiagnosis of which was costing a Fortune 25 company in the United States millions of dollars, actually a month, because they were unable to access the upside of this poll. So the wisdom is in you. You were able to come up with this content. All that was needed was for me to raise the question, if autonomous business units and integrated business units were a polarity, what would the upsides be? What would the downsides be? You gain that competitive advantage. You able to increase the speed and the sustainability of going after this poll. So that gave them a competitive advantage. So I want to share a little bit then. When I went to the half day we spent with them, all 200 people in the room from all over the world were in table groups of 6, and they generated this content fresh for themselves in each table group. And then I asked them, what would the action steps be? And they generated these action steps to make sure we hold on to entrepreneurial initiative and speed and responsiveness. And then what are the action steps to make sure we have integration and collaboration? And then what would early warnings be that would let us know we're heading towards bureaucracy and red tape, or we're getting slower? And what would the early warnings be that we're getting into silos and excess competition, et cetera? So they generated those maps, and that's how we moved. We supported them in being able to do both, have autonomous business units and integrated business units. And that gave them a competitive advantage with any organization that would see this as a problem to solve. So final key points. Every change effort is part of an infinity loop energy system, and polarity energy is at play. Having all the power and all the alignment in a change effort is not enough to overcome the misdiagnosis of treating a polarity as if it's a problem to solve. If you want to guarantee the failure of a change effort, just tie it to one pole of a polarity. It doesn't matter which pole. If you want success, tie it to both poles of a polarity. That polarity will always be available to leverage because polarities are indestructible. Okay, so let me stop sharing here and deal with some questions and insights. And people can raise your hand and ask a question verbally, but you can also put questions in the chat, and Peter will be just sharing those with me, and I'll be glad to respond as best I can.
Cool. Yeah, so everyone start putting your hand up or putting a question in the chat. I'll call on you. I'll warm up Barry with a question of my own. And just, what struck me first is how like this model could be used in any domain, really, not just in business, but in politics and relationships, personal development, spirituality. And the thing that I want to sense into and double click on is the first step of the model, that I think 5-step model, the seeing. Like, how do you spot a polarity? Like you start with a value and then you work from there, not seeing that problem solution thing. Like, how do you actually spot a polarity in a certain domain of life?
Well, there are 2 ways that polarities show. First of all, polarities always have a tension in them. There's a built-in tension. So if you enter a situation in which there is some tension, the next thing to ask is there one way polarity shows up as resistance to change? Some group is going after something that's important, and another group is resisting, is dragging their feet. Or everybody says they're going after it, but they don't seem to be doing it. And so the resistance is an unconscious resistance rather than a conscious one, which was in this case was the so that shows up as you say you want to do something, but you're not doing it. And so what might be that resistance? What might be that value you're afraid of losing that could cause that? Another way that polarities show up the tension is when two groups are polarized. And when they're polarized, what you can do is listen to what they're saying and hear what are the values that are being articulated that people are holding on to. Or it may show up as a fear. I'm afraid we're going to lose this. If I go with you, then if we agree with you, then we're afraid that this is going to happen. And so the opposition becomes resource with a polarity because each are holding up their values. So you can just listen, okay, what are those values that are being held? And each of them will be afraid of the other's value because of its downside. So opposition becomes resource because each of them is aware of a value they're afraid of losing, and the other group is the value they're afraid of losing. So that helps you with them create the content of the map.
Mm-hmm. And so it seems central, like emotional agency in order to be in relationship with fear without trying to shut it down right away. I wonder if you can speak about like building that kind of emotional agency with fear.
Well, one of the things that a polarity map does is it gives people a place to stand with their values. So you can convert the fear into a value. The fear will be about losing something. So it might come across as anger. So anger floats on a sea of fear. If somebody's approaching you, somebody's really angry, the question is, what are they afraid of? You can ask, what are the concerns that cause you to be so angry? Once you understand what those fears are, it'll be about some kind of loss. And the loss informs you what the value is. So now you're giving them a place to stand on the map in which their fears are legitimated as something they have. Not that you believe the fear is actually is necessarily true. It doesn't matter whether it's true or not in the first analysis. It's like, what are you afraid of? We need to know that. And then we need that lets us know what the value is. It's because the value that they're trying to hold on to is what we need to make sure we get. They get a place to stand. Now, the people who are opposing them also have a value fear proposition. And if it is a polarity, there will be two upsides and two downsides.
Awesome. So we'll pivot to the Q&A. Jostin, you had something similar question that you just asked. Do you want to add on to what Barry just said?
Yeah, just like Barry, thanks so much for being with us. And if you talk with people and they express their fear and you get to the value, do you have any kind of tips for how to help people overcome their fear once you've identified the values?
Yes, and this has to do with what you, first of all, it needs to be acknowledged that there is a concern. What you do is you look at ways that the value itself can be protected. So if I'm afraid, for example, the thing we just did, I'm afraid of too much bureaucracy, right? So we said, well, what are we going to do to make sure we minimize bureaucracy? What are we going to do to make sure that we support the autonomy? So I'm head of a business unit and I'm afraid of bureaucracy and red tape. What do you take it straight up. Okay, what are we going to do? What action steps are we doing that we could continue, or what might we add to make sure that we protect the autonomy of your business unit? That becomes the first question. So rather than convince them, no, you need to, what you need to do is you need to build in collaboration. You let go of that effort to get them to shift poles, and you support them with supporting the pole that they're on. Paradoxically, if you want them to be more involved in collaboration and centralized coordination, you need to support their autonomy of their business unit. So it's a paradoxical change model.
So any quick follow-up question? Nope. Okay. Narayan, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks so much for this, Barry. I've been a big fan of the polarities work. My question is a little bit nebulous. I see a lot of value in the framework of polarities, and I see it as a really valuable practice, both for individuals and organizations. I'm curious if you found any other sort of supplemental practices or frameworks that seem to play really nicely with polarities. Like, is it enough just to be told about how polarities works and then you're like, okay, I can start living this out? Or do you find that there's other things that have really been supportive in terms of seeing the world through more of a polarity lens?
Yes, I think there are some things. One of them is an assumption about the people with whom you're interacting, or the system with which you're interacting. And I think a very supportive assumption is that if you could see that person, with whom you're in disagreement, maybe, if you could see that person completely, love is the natural result. So the reason for being in the process is to see them more completely. It isn't just about leveraging something on a map. The desire is to see that person or that organization more completely. Because if we could, love is a natural result. What we're tapping into is the reality that we are in an evolving universe of interdependency. Everyone belongs. We belong to our own subgroup, but we belong to that universe. And so when we can see the person more completely, we see them as a part of the larger universe in which our interdependence exists. So all of us are connected and all of us are unique, which is another key polarity. So I think that orientation helps. Another thing that helps is the polarity, and I talk about this in the end of my book, and that is to recognize that all of the effort to make a difference sits on one pole of a polarity. And the other pole is, and that it's about doing, it's about making a difference. But the other pole is just being. And so the fact that we are loved just as we are, not as we want to be or think we should be, and so is that other person we're dealing with. They are loved just as they are. And so it's different when I try to make a difference in the world because I'm loved, rather than try to make a difference in the world in order to be loved. And so there's a foundation of being loved that I think is fundamentally important here. And that is where a polarity lens can be helpful. It can help us see ourselves more completely. Of course, we make mistakes. Of course, we've been hurtful. Of course. And we are loved just as we are. There's virtually all faith traditions talk about the notion of being loved unconditionally and belonging on the one hand, and being accountable for our actions on the other hand. And so being aware of those underlying polarities, I think, supports us in creative problem solving. Also helps, because whenever you've got a polarity, there are all sorts of problems to solve in order to leverage it. Like the question is, what are the upsides? That's a problem to solve, and you might use brainstorming as a technique to say, what would those upsides be? You can use active listening. So there's a lot of skills that we learn in other dimensions that support us in collaboration, for example, with others in creating a polarity map that works for all the stakeholders. And that's the challenge with a polarity map. The map has to work with all stakeholders. So you got work to do to get a polarity that works for all those there. But when it does, then how it works is the same all the time, every time.
Any quick follow-up share, Ryan?
That was super helpful. And I was seeing lots of smiles in the chat as you're speaking, Barry, so I know that resonated with more than just me.
Thank you.
So I believe Jewel or Greg Thomas has a question.
Yes. Wow, this is resonating really beautifully. Thank you so much. We're wondering about how you have applied this in D&I training.
We've applied it a lot, and we, being somebody besides me as a white male with a lot of money, we do it in partnership with people who are part of marginalized cultures. And so the fundamental polarity there, if we look globally rather than just nationally, is the tension between dominant cultures and marginalized cultures.
Mhm.
And I suggest, and I write about this in one of the chapters of the book, towards the end, I deal with those issues in which there's a lot of tension and people might, when they first see it, sort of react defensively. I try to build a case that this phenomenon exists and it's useful in a lot of sort of organizational settings for leaders and organizations. Towards the end, I look more at those issues that are challenging, and poverty, racism, and sexism are things for which a polarity lens can be very useful. And so I talk about their stacking polarities. So what I can't go into it real elaborately, but let me just suggest that or thinking without and thinking is a root cause and perpetuator of poverty, racism, and sexism.
Mm.
And any effort to address poverty, racism, and sexism that doesn't explicitly and intentionally focus on polarity thinking is going to be undermined, unconsciously undermined. There's an unconscious bias for or thinking that undermines the effort to deal with racism, just like unconscious bias undermines the effort. So you have to have unconscious gender bias, unconscious racial bias needs to be brought up and front and center so that we can now deal with it, right? So does the unconscious bias for or thinking. So for example, here are some key polarities. The first one is or and in the first place. That itself is a polarity. If we assume that we have to deal with the issue from an or mindset and we take that to any polarity, we're undermined, because it's not an or mindset won't work. For example, the first one, we have three, I'll talk about three natural desires which represent a pole of a polarity, which when focused on to the neglect of their sister, lead to poverty, racism, and sexism. The first is to protect. I want to protect my family, my loved ones, whatever. Now, the underlying polarity there is claiming power and sharing power. If in order to protect, I assume I have to claim power and can't share power, it leads to abuse of power, claiming power over, right? Now that leads to dominant culture and marginalized culture. So you have somebody dominating and others who are marginalized. The second one is to provide for. Now, the provide for dimension, of course I want to provide for, but if I assume that there can't be abundance for some and basics for all, I'll over focus on providing for me, mine, or us to the relative neglect of the marginalized culture. So I create the marginalized culture in the first place by domination, and then I perpetuate it for the same reason I got it in the first place, and in order to provide for my own, with the assumption I can't have abundance for some and basics for all. And the third one is I want to belong. And if we assume that we can't both belong to our group and everyone belong to all of humanity, what happens is, the desire to belong, by the way, is we look at wanting to be somebody who complies with the rules of my group. And so the way this shows up is we over focus on obeying the rules in order to belong. And what this leads to is that the polarity is justice and mercy. When we over focus on justice to the neglect of mercy, it leads to self-righteous abuse. So when you combine the desire to protect, to provide, and to belong without the other pair, it looks like poverty, racism, and sexism. And if you try to respond to those by just focusing on the other pole, you do not. It will not happen. you'll have the same kind of resistance that showed up in this company. And notice, by the way, in the company that I did the example with, there's no bad people here.
Right.
Matter of fact, they all agreed to go there. But if you assume, for example, in abundance for some and basics for all, if you assume that you can't keep your really nice house and allow for basic housing for everyone, you will undermine efforts for basic housing for everyone. And even people who are on boards attempting to provide housing for everyone will resist it. It's to be an unconscious resistance to the degree they assume in their head that they can't have both their nice house and somebody having basic housing.
Wow.
So that's how or thing without and thinking undermines all of those things. So yes, it applies a lot to the JEDI space, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion space.
Wow. I just want to thank you so much. I want to quickly say that your work and your body of thought is fundamental to one of the people and one of the books that I think is very important. Have you seen this? Developmental Politics, How America Can Grow into a Better Version of Itself by Steve McIntosh?
No, but it's been mentioned to me. I'm going to get it.
It's an excellent use of your model to the political issues that are polarizing the country. So
yeah, that's great. We're almost over time, aren't we? Can we go a few more minutes, Peter? What is the status of the?
Yeah, I have to close down soon, but a few more minutes over the hour is fine.
So I'm going to share screen just to pick up on what you're saying, Greg. I want to share something at that level. So let me see here. I got to escape out of here. I want to go to just one slide that will relate to exactly what you're talking about. I want to, now I've got to get I've got to move this thing is in my way.
you can see it. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know. But my thing is covering my screen, so I can't get to the right slide I want to do here.
I think you were on the right slide, dealing with individual freedom, common good, disorganized government.
Yep. So now, this is what I want to share with you real quickly. So centralized and decentralized, and this is about the COVID crisis. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we decentralize in order to have individual freedom. We centralize in order to promote the common good. So if we see we can do both. We can have individual freedom and the common good, and we can have a healthy people and a healthy economy. However, if we over-focus on decentralized, we're going to have a disorganized government. If we over-focus on centralized, we're going to have a concern about big government. If we see this as either or, then what happens is it creates a vicious cycle in which we have an unhealthy people and unhealthy economy. Now, so we need in order to leverage both upsides. But if it becomes or, then there are 2 points of view here that get in a power struggle. If in the power struggle, those who want individual freedom, if they win, all the energy goes away, avoiding big government and going towards individual freedom. Now, the problem with that is they see this as the whole point of view. That's it. So what happens is they're not seeing the other. And what happens is you end up getting the downside, which is disorganized government. And then you get the downside of the other one as well. So we need to do both. Now, what happens if the power is in favor of the common good? Well, what happens is it looks logical. We need to go from disorganized government towards the common good. You end up with big government, and then you end up with disorganized government. So what you need to do is bring to it in order to get the upsides of both. So I'll stop sharing here, but yes, that's how it works. And so thank you.
Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah, and definitely check out Jewel and Greg's work. They're doing good stuff with the Jazz Leadership Project. So that brings us to time. Barry, any final thoughts you would like to leave us with?
Just to, I'd like to encourage you to read the book, I want to encourage you. Towards the end of the book, I talk about another important polarity, and that is well, just some key polarities to share with you. You are unique. We are all unique, and we're all connected. We're each unique. We're all connected. We're all loved unconditionally, and we are all accountable for our actions. And it's important that in your effort to make a difference in the world, that you also take time to celebrate life, which is another polarity, to do both. And that's the way to be in for the long haul. So.
Awesome. Awesome. Man, I'm loving this model, Barry. I think the world needs to know about it. And love to have you come back to the Stoa for some more sessions. And so I'll make some announcements in a moment, but on behalf of the Stoa, thank you so much for coming to see us today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll just plug one event coming up, big one. Ken Wilber is coming to the Stoa next week. I'm super excited for this. Making sense of everything, the wisdom of integral theory. I imagine we'll have some polarity thinking in that session. So you can sign up for there on the Patreon. That's at November 22nd at 4 p.m. So that being said, Barry, everyone, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today.